Hey guys, this is Liz Summerhays, and my topic this week is on CSS values and units. The very first thing we cover is CSS values. CSS values are what we use to define the values that we are coding for a specific property. There are a lot of CSS value types, however, there are these three most common that we will see everywhere. The other ones can be looked up online, however, they are so rarely used that we will almost never come across them, especially at this stage where we are in front-end development. So the first most common type is numerical units. Numerical units can be split up into two categories: absolute units and relative units. There are many different absolute units. The most common is pixel. This is the one that we will use in most cases. There are others, which I will go through. The Q stands for a quarter millimeter. And then we have millimeter, centimeter, inches, point, and pica. Pica is 16 points on a computer. That's just what it's called, but those are absolute units, meaning that they do not change with the font size or the resolution of the computer. With the size of the screen, anything like that, they do not change. They will always look the same. An example of absolute units, on here I've got example 1, example 2, and example 3. I put pixels, centimeters, and picas just to kind of show the difference of how they are. So I set all of the widths, I set into the different units here, and you can see that they're almost the exact same. I tried to do that on purpose, but you can see that the width is 250 pixels on the first one, or 6.65 centimeters on the second, and 15.625 picas on the third. And now, while these are all in different units, we can see that they can kind of be measured in the same way. Relative units will change with the size of the screen, the default font size, and other such variables. The most common relative unit that you will come across is an M. An M is defined as the width of the letter M in whatever font is being used, which is why it's relative. It'll change depending on the width of that M. And X is the same thing, but it's the letter X instead of the letter M. CH is the width of the number 0. REM, or REM, is the width of the letter M. However, it doesn't change with inherited font sizes. So it's the default font, whatever that may be. So if you were then to change it in other CSS, it wouldn't have any effect. It would still be the width of the letter M of that default font. VW means that it's the viewport width. Viewport width just means the width of the screen that you're viewing in. So like if you didn't have your browser at full screen, if you had it on that smaller scale, the width of that viewport would be whatever that width was, and if you were to increase that width, it would change. Same thing with VH, it's the height of that viewport. Example of relative units, I wanted to kind of give an example of how these things would change. So most of it's on the first one. The third one is almost the exact same, but I changed the width of the viewport to show how the font size would change with that viewport. So the first one I have here is just 250 pixels with 1 M. So that font is the width of that letter M in that font. The next one I did it into a different font, and you can see barely, because they are very similar fonts, but you can see barely that they are slightly different in length. This is because the M in the font family Garamond is a different width. It looks almost the same because I added that one A, whereas if that A wasn't there, the line would be shorter to show exactly how it is shorter. With example 2, I did the same thing because it's the same thing with X as with M. So you see that width has changed. Now with the addition of the letter A there, it has created it almost the same size. Example 3 there is with the viewport at 2 different widths. So the first one was that the width was fairly small. I had it about half of my screen size. Whereas on the right, the example 3, the viewport, I had extended it all the way to the edge of my screen so that the font got a lot bigger because it was 3 times of that of the viewport. Now there are some CSS values that are unitless, meaning they don't have any units at the end. You don't need to panic, that's okay. Some of them are like that. They don't all need values, such as margin. Margin, when you put a 0 for a margin, a 0 is a 0. It does not matter what unit it's in. A 0 is 0. 0 pixels is going to be the same thing as 0 centimeters. 0M is going to be the same thing as 0 viewport or viewport width. The same thing with padding and with line height. Those do not need value units. However, it is good to be in the habit of using those units just to be on the safe side. Now we're going to talk about percentages. Percentages are a lot like the relative absolutes, meaning they can change. However, with percentages, it changes depending on what its container is. So in this case, we see that we have an absolute width layout with pixels and a relative layout with percentages. That viewing window there, I had put the width at 75% for that purple box. And so where it was, even though the font size is going to change depending on the layout as well. So that is very similar there. Then the next the next slide will show how that changes with the width being with percentages. So you can see that as the screen got larger, so did the box with the percentages. So it'll just be the percent, it'll take up, in this case, 75% of whatever I have the viewing window as. Colors. Colors are a lot of fun. They can kind of get a little complicated though. When you're coding for colors, there are 6 different ways that you can code for those colors. You can use their name, which isn't optimal because there aren't very many. It's very limited in the number of colors that you can use. There is hexadecimal, which is a 6-digit code that will tell the computer what color. RGB and RGBA, and then HSL and HSLA, which I'll talk about in just a second. So our example of name and hexadecimal colors, here you can see that my div class color name, I had red, orange, and navy, and in the CSS, that's exactly what I used. I used the words red, orange, and navy, which then gave me those colors in my boxes. For the hexadecimal code, you can see that that code translated to different colors. And I put the code on the boxes so that you could see what it was, as well as in the CSS. It's really nice with the coding program that I use, which is Visual Studio, that it'll show me a little window of the color, a preview of the color in my code as I'm working on it. The next is RGB and RGBA. RGB stands for red, green, and blue. And you'll use those 3 numbers that can range from 0 to 255, and they will change depending on the values that you use for that. RGBA is the exact same thing, although A stands for alpha, which essentially controls the gradients. So here I use the exact same values for RGB, but in RGBA I added those, I added that opacity, so that it has 0.55 opacity, 0.75, and 0.95. So you can see that even though they are the same color, that alpha, has changed the opacity to make it look different. Same thing with HSL and HSLA. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. And the same thing with the A is the alpha, or the opacity. So when you, if you can think about it like a color wheel, you have 360 degrees. That first value, the hue, is going to be a degree on that color wheel. So it goes from 0 to 360. And that will pick your hue. Your saturation is how much of the hue, it's like kind of how focused it is, how intense it is. And then your lightness is how much white there is in it, or how light it is. So on here, I did the same thing with RGB. I did the HSL with the 3 different colors. And I use the same colors for the HSLA to show that the opacity changes. It'll change the color a little bit. Even though they are the exact same hue, saturation, and lightness, that alpha changes the opacity, making it a different color. So all of this I got from developer.mozilla, which is a great source for everything. I was able to learn a lot in putting all of this together, and what I read there really helped me to understand how the CSS values and units work. It's a great tool to use. I would definitely recommend it. Well, that's all I have, so thank you so much for watching. I know it was kind of long, but I really appreciate you guys sticking around for it, and I hope it really helped in understanding what CSS values and units are and how they work.